All right, as always, God's amazing. Let's call Isaiah chapter 19 with Egypt in this chapter. That for the first, 15 verses or so, seems to describe the judgment coming to Egypt. However, the latter half or latter portion of the chapter is going to describe their restoration in a description, I guess, that's even more hopeful than the description of the restoration or the hope that's left for Cush and its remnant in the previous chapter. But in the first 15 chapters that describe Egypt's judgment, it is going to describe God coming against Israel for its idols in verse 1. In verse 2, it is going to describe the way in which he is going to divide or turn them against one another. In verse 3, to the degree that they will be utterly worn out by the ordeal. In verse 4, he's going to talk about the way in which he is then going to put them under a hard master that's going to seem to repay them for at least the years that they have been a hard master to, among other nations, Israel during the time of the Exodus. But verse 5 is going to talk about the way in which the waters of the seas and rivers and canals will be dried up, parched, and foul. Not just the waters, though, but commerce is going to seem to be dried up by the time you get to around verses 9 and 10. As the final set of verses describing the condition of their judgment in these days runs from verses 11 through 15, describing the way in which their princes, counselors, and wise men are going to be left clueless. Verse 12, challenging the wise men, let them tell you that they might know what the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt. In some ways seeming to mock them and all of the wisdom they had accumulated. In this chapter, it's probably important to note that going back to the Exodus, some of the things that they were able to do were actually real wonders. However, they were nothing compared to the genuine miracles of God, which we're being reminded of once again as verse 15 will conclude, and there will be nothing for Egypt that head or tail, palm branch or reed may do. As the latter portion of the chapter that describes their restoration doesn't start out in a way that sounds all that encouraging when it says, in that day the Egyptians will be like women in verse 16, and will go on in verse 18 to say, in that day they will speak the language of Canaan. However, it will then go on to say what seems to mark a transition or an upward trend when it says they will swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. Verse 19 saying that in that day, or the section running from roughly verse 19 through verse 22, it will say, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day, which is verse 21. Verse 23 saying he will make a highway for them in that day. And then finally, verse 24, I will read the conclusion that says, in that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt, thus our title, and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. Reminding me once again, going all the way back to chapter 2 in his description of the judgment coming to Israel, the way in which his description of the difficulties ahead still included a measure of hope. Likewise, as he is describing the judgment coming to the nations and he is describing the difficulty in the days ahead for them, that description still includes a measure of hope. In much the same way that we see the revelation unveil final judgment in the form of 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. In those first 2 sets of 7s, before the 7th is revealed, there is a pause for a call to repentance, a word that we can often hate to hear, so much so that we rarely even use it in our culture anymore. However, it's simply a call to stop doing the things we don't always even realize are making the world more toxic. Things not unlike the habits the Egyptians were going to have to become exhausted with before God was going to bring them healing.